Now, this afternoon we've planning to make a report on the events which took place in the movement over the past 2 or 3 weeks, referring, of course, in particular to the untimely passing of 3 of our believers, Brother Wolfgang in Germany, Hans Pfeiffer of Austria, and Sister Helena Tintner, also of Austria. The most important of these 3 names is that of Brother Wolfgang Meyer, simply because he occupied a position of full-time work in the European field and carried the very heavy and extensive burden of preaching the message in Germany, Austria, Portugal, Kenya, so far as the free world is concerned, and then in all the Eastern Bloc nations of Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia and East Germany, so far as the world behind the Iron Curtain is concerned. In giving this report, my purpose is to, first of all, carry your minds along step by step as the experience came to me, and then to examine as we go along the reasons that God has revealed to us for this event taking place, and to underline the important lessons that must be learned, otherwise the whole experience, of course, is going to be one tremendous waste. I'd like to make the observation at this point that it has been one thing to have lived through this experience and gained for myself tremendous personal blessings therefrom, deep understandings of God's Word. Another thing to attempt to convey to a listening audience in words that which I know by personal experience. A number of times as I found myself back in Europe, travelling back and forth to meet the various commitments that arose out of this incident, I found myself wishing that every believer in the world could be right there with us, going through these same experiences so that they would understand just what was happening and learn the whole thing by direct personal contact with this problem. However, the best we can do, of course, is to relate what we've experienced, and with the help of God's Spirit, hope and trust that each will therefrom gain something of great value as we move on to the final stages of the conflict of the ages. Before we come to the actual happening itself, I think we should consider something of the context. By the context, I mean the nature of the message which is being preached at this particular point of time. Now, as is well known to our believers around the world, the great emphasis in our message up until the last 12 months has been on the spiritual regeneration of those who believe in the gospel as the saving power of God to deliver from sin. And as we have observed and stated in our camp meeting sessions, this has produced an imbalanced message, because Christ came to restore physical, mental and spiritual man, not just the spiritual. But in the past 12 months, the Lord has been opening up to us a new vision altogether, bringing home to our minds a complete work dealing with all 3 aspects of mankind and his needs. The message has been with power, and we are glad to witness within our ranks some very, very significant and evident results of this kind of enlarged and broadened message. For instance, my mind goes back to the fact that prior to this point of time, those believers amongst us who came there with serious diseases, and I think particularly of cancer, because it is the one which more than any other has been the life taker amongst us so far as sickness is concerned, that these people with great certainty died. In fact, I can't think of anybody who really became seriously ill with cancer who survived it prior to the last 12 months. I think of Sister Hackett up in Canada, British Columbia, a very fine sister who developed cancer some 4 or 5 years ago. We went to visit her. she was a very, very good spirit, but she knew she had but a few weeks left to live, and sure enough, in about another 3 months, she had passed away from this illness. In Tennessee lived another sister, Sister Ann Burkon, likewise a very warmly spiritual person who loved this message very dearly, longed to see his final triumph, and she came down with cancer, and despite all the efforts that were extended to her, natural treatments and so forth, and she was a very complete believer in natural treatments, she likewise passed away. But a new era has dawned in this movement, because two other sisters have been pronounced extremely ill with the same sickness. We're glad to see both of them at the camping in this year, well on the way to recovery, and one of them now given a complete and total bill of health in this particular respect. Now, one such is right here in this room this afternoon. I wonder if you just briefly tell the story, Wayla. The first-hand report, you have to come over here by the microphones. The first-hand report, of course, is always better than a second-hand one.
I guess I don't know really where to begin, but in February of 77, the diagnosis of cancer was delivered to me, and at that time I was very ill. I was in bed and hadn't been able to eat for about 3 weeks, and knew that I had about a month left to live.
What was the date again?
In February of 77.
Uh-huh.
And whereupon my husband flew me down to the Hoxie Clinic in Tijuana, and they there also told me that I was much worse than what I realized. But they did give me help and put me on their treatment. I came home, was in bed for many weeks, and I started upon a good works program, which is the only thing I knew, reading every book I could get my hands on the subject of cancer, and trying to decide which I had to do and not do if I were going to get well, all the time asking for God's blessing, of course. I did claim promises, but I guess I didn't know how to go about it really. Anyway, my experience was an up and down one. I did make progress, but it seemed like each time I reached a peak of feeling pretty well, I would be back in bed again. And then we attended camp meeting, whereupon Fred gave the messages on our own works and the study of Abraham and Ishmael. I didn't grasp it fully until in December of last year. I should say, I guess, maybe I better back up. I had fixed up myself a program after reading all these books of each thing I must do and must not do if I were going to live. And I typed them all up on a piece of paper and hung it on my cupboard door. It even included the time schedule. At 9 o'clock I was to do this, and at 9:30 this, and included everything that must be done. And my whole life really hung on that paper. I really depended on that schedule to give me life again. Well, in December I became very ill and was bedfast again. All the old pain came back. I couldn't breathe properly, I couldn't turn over, I couldn't sleep, I could hardly eat. It was all the same old picture. And I thought I was going to die again. So I did a lot of praying and searching. And the Lord revealed to me that that piece of paper was my Ishmael. So I managed to get out of bed and tear the paper off the wall. And then I went back and knelt down. And my prayers took a new aspect. I put everything in the hands of God and told him if I were to live, he would have to save my life, that truly my own works couldn't do it, as I had more than proved. And I crawled back into bed with a lot more peace. It took away my fear of dying. I really hung on to God and believed that I would not die, that he would see me through, and that he would save my life no matter what it looked like and no matter what I did. Not that I would go out and deliberately break the laws of health or anything. And after that, my progress was steadily uphill, and I clinged to him. I did cling to him totally for healing and for life, rather than anything I could do. And I have not had a sick spell that put me back in bed since then. I have steadily improved until this summer. I've worked harder than I have in many years. I have more than ample energy. And upon my visit to the clinic this time, they gave me a total clean bill of health and said there was no malignancy.
Thank you very much. There was Sister Waver Clark of Kamiah in Northern Idaho, where she and her husband are now living. Both are here in the room at the moment, and we thank Waver for that testimony of her experience. In other words, when she came to understand that God is our doctor, He heals all our diseases and forgives all our iniquities, that the death sentence was removed, and today, as she sits in this room, she is a picture of good, normal health. Although a few weeks ago at camp time, we could still see that she had the mark of a cancer patient on her then, but that's all gone now, and full health is now restored to her. Another sister at the camp meeting likewise was seriously ill with cancer, and the doctor advised her that because the cancer was in the colon, that she could expect to have emergency surgery at any time in the next few days, so to speak. Because as the cancer enlarged, of course, it would cut off the colon, and then there would be a build-up of waste products, which in turn would bring about a speedy death unless surgery was undertaken. And she likewise grasped the principle now being taught in regard to true medical missionary work, and that surgery has never taken place, even though this is now quite some months ago when it was predicted. Full health has not yet been recovered, but it is on the way, and the neighbours, another family of believers, have observed and told me that on a number of occasions they have seen the sister suffering from weakness and lack of strength because of the presence of this disease. But as she laid hold upon God's strength, they could see her visibly recover strength and go about the many duties which were called upon her to undertake, which she was called upon to undertake. And there are other stories too we might relate, but I don't want to fill the tape with this particular aspect of the story. But I do want to lay down this background to emphasize the point that we are living in a period when God has begun to manifest Himself amongst us as the life giver, so far as our physical needs are concerned, as well as being the life giver so far as our spiritual needs are concerned. During the camp meetings in California and Arkansas, as well as back in Germany, of course, God was presented with clarity and power as being the one who puts life where there is death. Abraham's experience was drawn upon quite heavily to make this point, as it was seen that his trouble was his inability to believe that God could put life where there was death, both in his own body and that of Sarah's body, and thus bring forth the child of promise. And so with this background, with this context, the news came to us of the accident which took place in Vienna. It took place on a Wednesday, about 11:30 in the morning, and those of you who haven't heard the details, I'll relate them briefly as follows. Wolfgang had a great burden to go down into Romania to preach the gospel there, and the believers in that country were eagerly waiting for the visit that he would make to them. So it was that he and Brother Hans Pfeiffer, a brother from Austria about the same age as Wolfgang, a very earnest and sincere believer, presented themselves at the Romanian border with their passports and visas in proper order for the entry into this country. The Romanian authorities kept them waiting there for 4 hours, at the end of which time they finally said, "Right, you may now enter the country." But before they could drive in, a halt was called, and they were told to wait a little longer. And they heard one of the officers making a telephone call, after which he came out, took their passports and cancelled their entry permits, and thus obliged them to turn back into Austria again. Well, greatly disappointed about this, they turned back, and returned to the city of Vienna, where on this particular Wednesday they apparently had some activity on, and they went out and picked up Sister Helena Tintner. She took the back seat in the car. Wolfgang had the passenger seat, and Brother Hans Pfeiffer was the driver. The car was a medium to small car, a little Citroen. It wasn't a real tiny car. It was bigger than the Morris Minor, for instance, but it wasn't quite a medium-sized car either. One of those sort of smaller cars. They'd also invited a third sister, another sister, to come with them, Sister Skovsky, but she fortunately was tied up with some other commitments and couldn't go with them. They drove onto the Autobahn and were proceeding to their destination down toward Baden, which is to the south, I believe, from Vienna in Austria. In the meantime, there entered the freeway a man who was going to Vienna to attend a very important meeting in the hospital system. This man was quite a high official in the system, and something to do with the accounting department. And for some unaccountable reason, he drove onto the freeway going in the wrong direction. It was a 3-lane freeway, and he proceeded several kilometres, despite the fact that the traffic coming in the opposite direction flashed their headlamps and blew their horns at him, trying to alert him to the fact that he was going in the wrong direction. In the meantime, the car with our 3 folk in it were proceeding along in the 2nd lane, and Hans decided to pull out into the 3rd lane and pass the vehicles on his right. He did so at exactly that split second of time necessary to bring him head-on into the oncoming car. Both vehicles, they estimate, were travelling at 130 kilometres, which is 80 miles per hour each, making a combined collision speed of 160 miles per hour. At which speed we recognise, of course, that survival of any persons in the car is absolutely impossible unless a very, very phenomenal miracle should take place. The drivers of both vehicles were cast down onto the roadway. Hans Pfeiffer was killed. I believe he died on the way to the hospital, as did Wolfgang. But the driver of the other vehicle, a certain a man named Gruber, which, by the way, means digger. It's like the English word grubber. It's to dig a hole or such thing, which we thought was quite a significant name in this particular case. The newspapers declared Wolfgang, Hans and Sister Tintner to be guiltless in the accident, all the blame resting upon the other man who had no business driving on the wrong side of the freeway. Wolfgang was pinned inside the wreck, as was Sister Tintner, and he sustained a broken neck from the forward whiplash, and we believe also a broken, left forearm, which was no doubt was left. Well, I'm not sure was left or right, which was broken because he no doubt put his hand out instinctively to ward off the collision, and in so doing, of course, the impact broke his forearm. The news came to me first of all while we were travelling into Oregon. I should better say the information that I should call Germany came to me as I was travelling north to Oregon after the camp meeting. I learned of the necessity to make a telephone call to Germany about 9 o'clock, I should imagine, on Wednesday morning immediately after the camp. And I looked at my watch and I realised, of course, that it was not a very appropriate time to call. I simply imagined that it was a matter of business, perhaps an inquiry on Wolfgang's part in regard to our projected visit to Norway together. And so I said, well, if I call now, he's almost certain to be out. I shall wait till this evening and telephone at a time when I will catch him at home quite early in the morning. So I planned to call that night. So we drove all that day and arrived in Medford, Oregon that night, and the people who had passed the message on to me said to me, "Did you call Germany in regard to that emergency?" And I said, "No." I didn't know it was an emergency. And instantly there passed through my mind, very vividly, the conviction that Wolfgang had been killed in an auto accident. But the proposition was so ridiculous, so unacceptable to my mind, I simply brushed it away and rejected the idea as a foolish notion. That was Thursday night, and it so happened my voice was extremely scratchy, and I just didn't have the confidence to make a call overseas because I was quite sure I wouldn't be understood, and so I deferred the call until the following evening. It didn't really matter because if I had called, there would have been nobody at home in Heppenheim anyway, so that I would not have gained or lost anything by not putting in the call that night. But all day next day, we went about our activities, and on Friday night, I planned to make a definite call to Germany and ascertain what the matter was all about. We got a group together that night, and I gave a study, at the end of which a telephone call came through from Sister St. Clair, and she asked me had I called Europe. I said no, and I said what did they wish to call me about, and she did inform me that there had been this accident, and that Wolfgang and 2 others had been killed in this wreck. Well, believe me, that was a shock, as I know it came to every believer around the world in the same fashion, as a very, very great shock indeed. Well, I said to her, there's got to be a mistake. I said, you've got the message confused, I'm sure, because I just can't see how this could be true. In any case, I said, I'll call Germany and I will have this confirmed or denied or clarified as the need may be. She said, good. And when you do, be sure and call us back and let us know so we can know for certain just what the story is ourselves. Well, when that call came through, it was about 8:30, and that meant it was 4:30 in the morning in Germany. And even though the matter was now urgent, I felt that I had better wait until they were up and about again, which meant I would not call before 11:30 in the evening, catch them about 7:30. The folk in the Meyer household normally go to bed very late and get up late, so there's no point in calling too early in the morning. 11:30 I called and I couldn't raise any reply. I waited then till about 12:30 and called again, and again got no reply. I called again at 1:30 in the morning, and this time I did get a reply, and Frank Platten, a very close friend of Wolfgang's, a long-standing believer in the message, answered me in the German language, which is the only language he understands, and I was able to gain from him confirmation that this thing had actually taken place, and the 2 other people who had died with Wolfgang were Sister Tentner of Speyer in Austria and Hans Pfeiffer, likewise of the country of Austria. Needless to say, I couldn't sleep the rest of the night, excepting for very, very short little snatches of rest, perhaps. And it was a shock which went down to the very heart of my whole being, and I had absolutely no answer at this time as to why such a thing could possibly have taken place. I was very pleased to find in my own reactions that there was no disposition whatsoever to start making any plans of my own, to turn to my own works, or to even allow myself to become overly concerned about the event. I was assured that God had not been taken by surprise, and that he most certainly already had the answer worked out to cope with this particular problem. And so I determined to quietly go about the business at hand. I had a weekend of meetings ahead of me, all day Sabbath and Sunday, and it's a Monday evening as well, and I determined that I would quietly go about my business while I kept working at trying to make contact with Gwenda or Gary or somebody who'd give me more exact information as to what had really taken place and what was going to happen so far as funerals and so forth were concerned. In the meantime, I very deliberately kept my mind empty of any personal solutions to the problem, so that only God could put into my mind just what he wanted me to know in this particular case, and in turn to direct me as to what I should do about the matter, whether I should go back to Europe, attend the funeral, or simply stay in the United States of America and carry on with the work here. I was very deeply committed to the fact that it must be God's works and not my works under any circumstances whatsoever. My repeated attempts to contact anyone in Europe brought no success until I think possibly Monday, when I finally was able to contact Peter Storch, a young English-speaking German who lives in my household, assists Gary with the printing, and at the same time is taking lessons in building construction at a nearby school. He was a ministerial student at the Adventist College of Marienhof in Darmstadt, but because of this message he's abandoned that and now is seeking to build a career outside of the Adventist Church organisation, a development with which we of course are very, very pleased indeed. He told me that Gwenda and Gary should get back from Vienna somewhere about Wednesday or Thursday, and that I should call again about that time, which I plan to do. In the meantime, my mind continued as more or less a blank as to what the reason for this disaster, or seeming disaster, actually was, and I refused to lose patience. I simply waited upon God to open my mind to just what was what. And then, one early morning hour as I lay awake, the thought came home to me with very, very powerful force that this was a confrontation between God and Satan, a test as to whether God's power or Satan's power was to be the dominant power in this particular movement. My mind went back to my experience in New Zealand in January when I was preaching the message of God being our doctor. The devil had smitten me and laid me low at my back in bed, and at that time I was very, very clear in my mind that this was Satan's declaration that while we preached that God was the healer, he would demonstrate that he was the destroyer or the health taker. And I felt very strongly in the New Zealand camp meeting that it was important that God emerge as the victor in this particular case, that he be the one who would demonstrate his power and give his answer to Satan and show that he was not just a God of words but also a God of action. In response to my firm faith in this direction, God raised me up. I've never had the least trouble with that back injury since that point of time. It was a complete restoration, a very dramatic one, to which we can give the credit to God and to God alone. And so likewise, it became clear to my mind that in this particular situation, we had been preaching that God is the one who puts life where there is death, and Satan had come in to demonstrate that he puts death where there is life. And there was a question as to which power was going to be the prevailing power in this particular movement. Finally, on Thursday morning, we were able to make contact with Gwenda. We then learned, to our surprise, that the funeral was not going to take place until the following Wednesday, which made it 2 weeks exactly from the day when the accident happened. In fact, the accident happened at 11:30, I understand, and the funeral was scheduled to take place at 12, exactly 2 weeks later. And even for Europe, this is an unheard of thing. And the reason I learned later for this was that the work of burying the dead is a state occupation in Austria. It's not conducted by private enterprise. And in this particular funeral district, there were so many people to be buried that it was impossible to fit Wolfgang in for 2 whole weeks. And so the date was scheduled for that particular point of time. And Gwenda asked me, was I going over to Europe? And I said, I don't know. I'll have to pray about that and see what directions I get on the matter. Well, after very, very carefully and earnestly praying about it and reiterating once again I want to make no plans of my own, I felt a very clear and plain directive to go to Europe and present myself there for whatever purpose God may desire to work through me. And so on Friday morning at a little after 9, I took a plane from Boise, Idaho, and flew to Chicago, and thence to New York, and thence to Frankfurt overnight, arriving at the Meyer home at midday on Sabbath. I arrived there just as the morning service was breaking up. I should have been there earlier, but there had been a little confusion over my arrival time at the airport, and Gary had not come to meet me because he thought I was coming at 11, whereas in actual fact I arrived at 8. So I came there by train to Heffenheim, and that put me there when the church service was over. A providence which I'm thankful for, because at that moment of time I did not yet wish to address myself to the believers in general. I wished first of all to gain more information, so I have a clear understanding of just what the situation was in Europe at this particular point of time. And on the way over in the plane, I had read the book, the chapter in the book Desire of Ages, entitled Lazarus Come Forth, no fewer than I think about 5 times. I think it's in my Black Day Girls up the top there. And the more I read the chapter, the more I was impressed to believe that the experience of Christ in connection with the death of Lazarus was a preview of this particular experience which we were passing as well. And there was one sentence in this chapter which stood out in my mind with tremendous clarity and force. I'll just turn now to the chapter in the book Desire of Ages and note with you this particular statement. It comes here, I think, on page 528. Yes, on page 528 in the book Desire of Ages, it there says that had Christ been in the sick room, Lazarus would not have died. The state would have had no power over him. Death could not have aimed his dart at Lazarus in the presence of the life-giver. Therefore Christ remained away. Now comes the key sentence. He suffered the enemy to exercise his power that he might drive him back a conquered foe. Now my faith really grasped hold of the sentence, and I could see that God permitted or suffered Satan to exercise his power, the death of Wolfgang and the other 2 believers, that in turn God might drive Satan back a conquered foe. Now certainly we recognise that Satan had engineered this whole incident. God is not the destroyer, Satan is the destroyer. Satan engineered it with very, very careful and skillful planning, and God had permitted him to do what he had done for a very, very important reason. They were further impressed by the fact that the man who had driven the death car was not a wild and irresponsible youth, nor a person under drugs, nor a person who was intoxicated, but a mature and responsible person who could only do what he did if in some way or the other another power was in possession of him. And it was reported that when he drove on the wrong side of the freeway, that he seemed like a man who was bent on a mission and would not be deterred from it by all the hooting and tooting and light flashing of all the other motorists as he drove along the road. Now, interestingly enough, this man is a man who is occupied in the system of medicine which is the exact opposite from that which we have been preaching of late. And it seems significant to us that Satan had used a man in that occupation to strike down our believers at the very time when we were presenting a message on health which is the exact opposite from that which this man represented. As I mentioned before, of course, his name is Gruber, which means a grubber or a digger, a man who digs a hole, and that of course is what he did so far as our believers were concerned. Furthermore, I understand he was a Roman Catholic of quite some standing, which makes the matter just a little bit more significant still. When I got to Germany then, the little group of folk who live in the household, Wenda, Gary and Peter Storch and myself, I think a couple of other folk, sat down and we discussed this chapter on Lazarus. To my interest, I found that already their minds had been directed to the same chapter. And as I talked with believers by telephone here and there, I found that this is the direction in which most minds had gone when this event had taken place. I also found that in Germany there was a very, very strong conviction that God would raise up these three folk once more, and that God would demonstrate his power as the resurrection and the life. And I was very interested and encouraged to find that this was a widespread conviction amongst the believers in this part of the world. Consequently, I found that the believers were not saddened, but were rather buoyant and joyous, expecting of seeing God do very great things. Already, I learned when I got there, they had gone down to Vienna and had been admitted to the morgue where the three bodies were laid out, and they had gathered round, I think about 15 of our believers, and a very earnest season of prayer had followed. And in this group there was a very, very definite conviction that God would raise up the dead amongst us. The time had come for him to work very powerfully in our midst, and he would do that. But even though they prayed most earnestly, the dead rose not, and they finally left the room, some with their convictions somewhat shaken, but others still absolutely convinced that God would raise the dead amongst us. I was much heartened by this, and I found that what these folk were believing in regard to this was very coincidental with my own thoughts, and that there was a very real harmony of thought amongst us, even though we found ourselves having been separated by wide geographical distances and lack of communication prior to this point of time. Well, the believers wished to come back, and as the local believers had lived around Heppenheim, something like 20 folk altogether, wished to come back and hear my thoughts on the matter, and this was arranged for late on Sunday afternoon. Now, up until this time, Wolfgang has always been my translator when I go to Germany. But I determined to step out by faith this afternoon and speak to the folk directly in their own language without the use of an interpreter. And I did this. I stepped out by faith, and I want to testify to God hearing my prayers, because I was able to speak to these folk for an hour and a half and say pretty much what I wanted to say. Now and again I had to get a little prompting from folk, which I was disappointed about. But I was able to speak to these folk directly in their own language for an hour and a half, thus saving the tedium of working for an interpreter. And the believers told me they understood everything I had to say, and at very, very seldom did they ever ask me to repeat myself to clarify a point which was not very well stated. So that to me was also a very encouraging omen in this respect. Now, this brought us down to Sunday, and in our minds we felt the direction of God to go down to Vienna, a journey of 500 miles or more, on Wednesday for the funeral. We leave Tuesday morning and drive down to the home of the Glaser family, who live very close to Salzburg, which is on the German-Austrian border, on the main freeway from Munich on down to Vienna. And then on Wednesday morning we would drive on to the actual funeral site. Well, I didn't know whether I should go down there or not, so I prayed about this again, determined still that none of my own works would appear, but only that God's works would appear in the whole matter. Came Tuesday morning and there was nothing to retard us from going, so we carried to the plan to go to Vienna. And looking back now, I can absolutely see how essential that particular journey was. Significant in this was the presence of another person who identifies with this movement. As you folk will not know his name, and as I don't want to I have to give a fairly bad report of this man's behaviour, so I don't think I want to attach his name to it. I just want to tell what happened rather than indict a particular person by name. So I'll just mention him as this particular brother as we go through the story. Now this man had been expecting Wolfgang to come to him, but Wolfgang not kept the appointment. Several days had gone by, Wolfgang still hadn't come, so this man finally telephoned to Heppenheim on Sunday evening, asking for Wolfgang, and hearing for the first time of the accident which had taken place now almost 2 weeks before. Naturally, of course, he was greatly shocked and said he would come at once to Heppenheim, but Gwenda said to him, don't come until midday tomorrow, as we plan to be out in Mannheim to do some business preparatory to what follows thereafter. So he said, right, he would come and arrive on Monday morning. This man arrived on Monday morning, and we got into conversation, and I found that he was a person with a very different spirit from that of all the other believers. And while the others had the faith to believe in God as the life giver according to his will, this man absolutely could see no light in that, and could only see the prospect of the resurrection taking place when Christ comes by and by. I found in talking to him that there was no kindred spirit between himself and myself whatsoever, so very different from the other one of the believers with whom I had spoken. On Tuesday morning he came to us and he said, would you like me to stand by your side in Vienna at the funeral? And I said to him, being very, very conscious of the fact that his spirit and mind were in anything but a tune or a harmony, well, I said, that's not necessary, I said, and furthermore, we don't know how long we'll be there, what accommodation problems we might have. We may have to stay in a hotel and pay, and that'll cost you money, nor what space you need in the car when we get there. So I said, I think it would be wiser for you to go back to your home and get back to your work. Well, he agreed to that, but asked could he come as far as Stuttgart, from where he'd take a bus that would bring him to his home, which was not too far distant from this large city. Well, we said that'll be fine. So Gary Davis and I departed in Wolfgang's car, which was not involved in the wreck. It was Hans Pfeiffer's car that was broken up in the wreck and totally wrecked. It'll never ride again. They just hauled it away and dumped it. And we started off with this brother in the back seat. Now very soon he engaged me in conversation again, and again I went through the rather painful experience of trying to help him to see what was beyond his spiritual power to see. And then he said, I believe I will come with you to Vienna. I'll go all the way. And immediately I prayed the Lord and said, Lord, please deliver me from this kind of burden, because we'll need large faith in Vienna, and this man is going to be a cloud over us. We'll have to rise above the influence which he will exert when we get down there to this place. So I said to him, I'd like you to understand, brother, that when we come to Vienna, you will not be able to support us because your belief and your attitude and your feelings are so entirely contrary to our own. So being a help to us, you're going to be a cloud. It would be better if you went home and did much praying and study until God opened up to your eyes the vision of his mighty power, and you become one with us in spirit and belief and so forth. Well, he answered me, and in his answer he revealed that he understood perfectly well what I had said. The implications and the significance of what I had said, and acknowledged that it would be better for him not to come to Vienna, but just the same, he said, I am going to come. We don't believe in force, of course, and so he wouldn't say, well, you can't come, but I simply made it very clear to him that, so far as I was concerned, I felt wiser and definitely preferable for him not to plan to come to Vienna, but he had his own mind made up. He's that kind of person, and to Vienna he came. Now my heart was very sad about this, and I was regretful that God had not answered my prayer, But today I must testify that I am deeply grateful that this man did insist on coming to Vienna, and that God answered my prayer in his own all-wise and wonderful way, letting that man come when my choice would have been for him not to come under any circumstances. Okay, we'll turn the tapes over at this point.